Okay, so my presentation is titled G Anywhere, Enhancing LabVIEW Development with a Cross-Platform Embedded Device Library. So what I'm actually going to be talking about today is, first of all, the Raspberry Pi Pico. Has anybody seen this? Are you loosely familiar with it? Okay, great. It's a hobby board. They're about $6. They have a microcontroller on them with an ARM processor, some programmable I/O logic, and a lot of I/O connectivity. And I'm also going to be talking about a topic that's essentially kind of been a bit of a hobby research project of mine over the past year or so. And I really like the idea of being able to compile G using G, so LabVIEW as a language, to be able to actually write code that can transform that into code that can execute somewhere else. And it's been a real journey of learning. Compiler engineering is a full-time job, so to speak. Many people have PhDs in such topics. All right, and I'll show you some demos. What I will say is I'm not gonna, there's way too much we could talk about today. And so I may hand wave some things and just say, okay, I'm not gonna talk about that. So have to save something for next year, right? Okay, so the Raspberry Pi Pico, as I mentioned, is a really great platform. It's kind of taken over in a lot of ways. Even Arduino is now making boards that have this chip on them, the little black chip in the middle. You can also get a variety of different connector boards, displays for peripherals. And the chip itself, is the little black square in the middle. There are several different, many different boards that utilize that chip and provide a variety of different I/O, memory, etc. Has anybody actually have one and played with it? I'm curious, how did you program it? C? Anyone? All right. So this chip is, as I mentioned, has an ARM processor. It does not have a whole lot of RAM for things like operating systems. You don't put an operating system on it, or you could probably put a small one, but there's not a lot to work with, but it does have a whole lot of I/O. And so typically you would be writing code that runs bare metal on the chip. So the kind of core libraries that are published by Raspberry Pi are essentially libraries for C, C++. Also, there's a great set of libraries, firmware for MicroPython. And MicroPython is nice because you can load the binary onto the board. And what ends up happening is you can see the USB drive and you can put Python scripts in there. And MicroPython is a subset of Python, and you can configure it to basically run those scripts at startup. It's a bit heavier. That infrastructure takes a bit of the space on the SRAM. Also, there's great libraries in Rust. Who here has played around with Rust? Okay, that's cool. So Rust is a text-based programming language, and one of the things that's really interesting about Rust is it has great type safety, memory safety, things that we have in LabVIEW. This environment has it. Like LabVIEW, complains with broken run arrows. Rust complains with a compile is broken messages, and so there's a lot of nice similarities in that regard. And it's really gaining a lot of momentum in the community as both an embedded platform, but also for writing software for web backend. Not so much user interfaces, although there's a lot of people building tooling for doing work front end, compiling to WebAssembly, et cetera. So I am going to be talking a little bit about Rust, but it's also going to translate into other text-based concurrency models. Also, what I've been working on with others too is, not so much dependent on knowledge of Rust. The idea is that we would use Rust as an intermediate representation of graphical data flow. And we would leverage that as an intermediate representation because it has a very solid foundation of core libraries, support for different hardware, frameworks for doing concurrency. Any questions so far? All right.
Just one comment. There's 2 megabytes of flash on board, right? So
that's where you're... depending on the board, probably.
That's where your OS would go, though. It wouldn't go in the SRAM. Would it?
Correct.
Yeah. Sorry. I thought I used it.
They have external flash.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then folks have done a lot of work with libraries to be able to actually load like the flash into memory. Derrick, I know you probably can speak more to that. I'm not an embedded engineer, but sometimes I play one on TV. Okay, so compiling G with G. Subtitle, proving to ourselves that G is a real programming language by writing a compiler in G that can compile itself. So this is not a project that's completed yet, but I think it's an aspirational goal. And programming languages often undertake the challenge of writing their language's compiler in their own language as an exercise in rigor. And one of the benefits of attempting to do that is every single rough edge will ultimately be discovered. And what ends up resulting once one is on the other side of that journey is a much better designed language and compiler. And so I would love to see something like that happen for LabVIEW. Now that we have classes, interfaces, and a variety of other tools, maybe we're closer to that than we think. Okay, so any compiler engineers in the audience? Anyone? No? Okay. So compilers generally are pretty low level, but basically all a compiler is something that takes instructions in one form and transforms them to instructions in another form. Pretty simple. Now, the instructions for a C program has a pretty complex set of semantics, and assembly code for a processor, is not something you probably want to spend too much time reading or coding. And so that gap is a fairly large one. But there are other types of compilers too, like source code to source code compilers or translation compilers, sometimes called transpilers or transcompilers. But basically the steps of compiling a text-based programming language are to parse the string data in the file, identify the different keywords, the tokens, like for, if, while, let, if you're defining variables, etc., and into a long stream of tokens, literal values. And then the next step is to do the syntax analysis based on the rules of the language to essentially then develop this structure, which is in memory, an object structure, which are things like a function object and a module object and variable objects and constants, and how they all link together. And a program is, the sequence of execution of those things. So we transform the string format of our source code into what's called an abstract syntax tree. And compilers go, steps further to generate data flow graphs and control flow graphs. So these first two steps are really only applicable for text-based languages. Well, I'm getting a call from Italy. So these first two steps are only really applicable to text-based languages. In LabVIEW, our source code is binary and it is a graph. So LabVIEW looks a lot, I mean, this abstract syntax tree looks a lot like a graph, nodes, edges, relationships. So what a G compiler needs to do is to generate code from a program's data flow and control flow graphs.
What is SAD?
What is SAD?
AST.
Oh yeah, AST stands for Abstract Syntax Tree. And most languages like Python and Rust will have libraries, and they're often named AST. And what you can do with these libraries, if you like, from core import AST, you can then do AST load a string with source code. And then what you will get out the other side, what's returned is an object, which is your code. You might get like a module, and then you could, in the module, list like all the method functions and classes and variables, and you could even invoke like an execute on it. Or you could traverse it, transform it, etc. So the AST is essentially the object model of the programming language in an like programming language object form that you can interact with programmatically. Is that about right? Anybody want to correct me or add anything? Okay. So it's really interesting. As I've been doing research on compilers, there is a tremendous amount of work that compiler engineers do to visualize data flow and control flow graphs from the AST that is basically being generated by the compiler, the upstream front end. And these data flow graphs look a lot like LabVIEW. It's kind of interesting. So getting back to, okay, that's great, we have a graph. What would that look like to translate into Rust or practically any text-based programming language that also has some tools for concurrency or parallelism? And yeah, let's dive in. So pretty much everybody can figure out how this code works. You've probably written something like this in the past. So how we would translate this to text-based code would be fairly straightforward. We could essentially define a couple variables for a constant. We could pass those variables into a function that concatenates, or we could just use an operator like plus or a concatenation operator, and then we could call a print function. So here I'm calling a couple functions, my concatenate strings and my print. Just you could think of those as built-in functions, at least for this example. Is this pretty straightforward to everybody? How many people here do some text-based coding? All right. So how many of you are mostly in like C? Okay. How many are mostly, let's say, Python? Okay. And then others in the room, kind of popcorn? JavaScript, front end, web, yeah. C#. Okay, so hopefully the code up here that's Rust code looks readable enough to understand what's going on. We could treat it as pseudocode. So what I've done here in this example is I've taken the top to bottom sequential code and I've reorganized it into a little graph showing data flow. Now, what control flow really is here is the top to bottom, right? So this code is going to execute top to bottom. If I flip those first two lines, will it affect the code at all? No, because they're not actually used. They're assigned statically up here, but they're not used until after both of them are assigned. So we can reverse the order. It ends up being arbitrary, but we have, by nature of writing things down sequentially, prescribed to the compiler that we may have the intention to execute these sequentially. Most modern compilers can actually tell. They build the control flow graph and they determine what can be done in parallel, which things can be reordered. If you have two functions that look the same, they'll actually replace them one with the other, etc. But I think the thing that I wanted to draw attention to here is that defining a constant, calling a node, these can have text-based equivalents. So if we were to execute this code, what we would essentially get is this. And I'm going to go out on a limb and try to execute without breaking my hello world. All right, wish me luck, everybody. And this is going to be so worth it, too. Okay, so, oh, good. Was LabVIEW stopped and restarted? So behind the scenes, on the side, I've got a tool that uses the, what's the new internet, not Internet Explorer, but the new Microsoft Edge browser and the WebView 2. So sometimes it's not happy when it can't find a network connection or something. Okay, here we go. If that doesn't work, I'll open the whole project. Okay, perfect. All right, so this is going to be one of those hand wavy parts. I colored my wires a little bit different so that I can kind of tell them apart, and these nodes kind of look like primitives. This is a concatenation function. This is a print function. And so these functions, basically, the reason why they're here is so that we can do the code generation of the diagram, basically. So if we run this, I'll first open this. And so what it did is it passed the program as CGI parameters to this cool website that lets you play with Rust code so that you don't have to install Microsoft Visual C on your computer and take up the gigabytes that way. And so you can see it even ran it. I think it ran it, yeah. And we've got a hello world. So this is LabVIEW running in the browser. Okay. No, please, that's fine. Thank you. But that's just a joke. So what I wanted to show you here is there is a Rust file. It's very simple. The generated code uses these unique identifiers just to make sure that nobody steps on each other's toes. I think I have something that will kind of compress that down a little bit. Let me try running it again and see. Nope, didn't work. That's what I get. So But these could be literally anything. They're just to basically make sure that nobody gets their toes stepped on. When we compile this in the terminal, we use the Rust compiler, and we just pass it the name of our file. To execute it, I think I have to do that. So this is a console application that was written in LabVIEW and then transpiled through Rust to run as an executable. I'm going to go a little bit further out on a limb and show an application that, that prompts the user as well. It's a fairly big project, so.
But the LabVIEW source is binary, right?
It is a binary, yeah.
You have PIs that convert this binary to...
No. So that's why I have those special functions that I'm calling that kind of have that green tint to them, and the wires that were kind of a little bit bigger and fuzzier. This code is not exporting or translating the .vi files. So these functions are essentially doing the code generation dynamically. Does that part kind of maybe make sense? So this is the hand wavy part I'm not going to go into. But when we call these functions, it generates the code representation of those functions. It's a little bit of the snake eating its tail.
So it's fixed function, right?
What's that?
So it generates code for some set of fixed functions, right?
Some things generate code for sets of fixed functions.
Okay.
But nothing's fixed. This is all very dynamic. And so it's using a system of basically dynamic calls to different classes through interfaces to do the code generation based on the type of code that we want generated. So we're not necessarily limited to Rust, if that makes sense. Okay. So I'm just going to do something high, and I connect, what's your name? See if this works. And so here we have a print line function and a read line function, and we've connected them with essentially kind of like an error cluster wire to handle the control flow, so that read line has to wait until print line runs, and then we trim white space off the end, and then we feed back a hi, whatever the user input, with an exclamation point because we're excited. And I'm going to pop this open. And so here is my file, hello prompt. Okay. And so you guys can see what this code looks like. It's very similar to the other example. It's making calls to the I/O standard in to read line, so it has a function to read basically. And then let's try to compile it. I'm going to use git bash here. Rust, I can even, there you go. Can you guys see that better? Okay, Rust C, hello prompt, .rs, okay. Oh. So it works. And again, yeah, control your applause. if we wanted to, drop another print, literally we, just go like that, rerun it, and it would print the output twice. Okay, so let's jump back into the presentation.
So your plan is to override those for all different kinds of languages, right?
Oh, people overestimate me having a plan to do everything. So I don't personally plan to do that, but it definitely is nice to make it flexible so that we can work on different parts of the project at different times. Yeah. Okay, so the example that we showed, and how much time do we have left?
Buses don't leave to the party till 5 or 6.
Nice. I may have a meeting at like 4:30 or so. Okay, so 4:15, I think? Yeah, okay, great. So how about parallelism? So the examples that I showed didn't involve doing anything in parallel that needs to happen in parallel. We talked about how we could reverse the order of these top operations, and it doesn't impact the code because there is no parallelism there. But if we did have code that needs to run in parallel, how would we do that? And so here's a great example. If we took a very kind of crude approach to translation compiling G into text-based code, this bottom code would take 3 seconds to run when that's not the intent of the programmer. So the way that we approach this is, the way that I've approached it is to look at a variety of different text-based programming language concurrency tools and models. And there's a variety of different tools and models. The one that kind of jumps out at first is threads. So threads are provided essentially by the operating system and hardware for managing things that can run in parallel with each other. So if you have multiple CPU cores, you can run threads in different cores, and they literally, will run in parallel on different cores. There are other forms of concurrency which are considered cooperative multitasking. And the way that these cooperative systems work is that the various blocking functions throughout the language, they have like special cooperative versions of these functions that when they need to block, they don't really block the thread. They just say, I can't do anything anymore. So they give up control. They cooperate to give control back to like a main execution loop. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but before we do that, let's take a look at threads. Fortunately, this model for kind of like how we call or create a thread and then how we wait on it and get its data back, it's pretty similar to how we do that with tasks and asynchronous functions as well. So here we have a main function. This is basically the definition of a program. And I don't really have a pointer here. Nope. So we'll see at the top where we say let thread 1 equal thread spawn. What it's doing there is it's creating a reference to a block of code. The block of code is the real wait milliseconds function that's waiting a second. So it creates a reference to that block of code and starts it running in a thread. That's a non-blocking operation, which lets us then move down to the thread 2 creation, where we can then create a reference to that block of code and its return values. And then what we can do is, if we know that the downstream code from those 2 waits, there's nothing else that can really need to or happen in parallel, we can at that point wait on both of those parallel tasks and join back together. And then print the results. And when this one prints, it will correctly print 2 seconds, demonstrating that it worked successfully. So I'm not going to go really deep into this. However, it's worth noting that a lot of languages, Python has an async framework, Rust has it, and the syntax is basically like built into the language. So when you are creating defining a function, you would essentially, before you name the function, you would say it's an async function. And when you do that, whenever you call it, it returns what's called a future. And the future is essentially the reference to that block of code and the data that will be returned by it. There's a variety of different kind of styles of implementation of async. Some of them start the work immediately when you call the async function. Some of them wait and they just leave it there waiting to be worked on. And it is then only when you get down to the bottom part, like here where we said, we want to join, where you actually call an execution engine and you pass it the set of async function calls that you want to make, and the execution engine sits there and cranks on them, and it says, oh, you want to turn, okay, you're ready, you don't need to work, okay, now you go, okay, and then it just kind of keeps pushing them all forward cooperatively. They all essentially yield control when they're not busy until it's completed. And those types of frameworks really require a variety of libraries, like HTTP libraries, file libraries, et cetera, to essentially conform to those conventions. So most languages will have like 2 sets of libraries. They'll have the standard library and then the async standard library. So in terms of, for running on the embedded processors like the Raspberry Pi Pico, so that device has 2 cores on it. And the way that people utilize that typically is to spawn a thread, and the thread runs in each core. And so running parallel code on the Pico will be more challenging. There are, however, embedded frameworks for doing cooperative multitasking. And from the research and conversations that I've had, those types of cooperative multitasking frameworks end up producing very, very good real-time performance. And so that is a good way to go using a very robust cooperative multitasking framework, which is essentially the scheduling engine for all the different tasks. For running like in the desktop or WebAssembly, or even embedded systems with much more memory and threads available to them, using frameworks like Rust has what's called the Tokio, Tokio framework for concurrency that's very good. So I've been experimenting with that. One of the challenges of doing that is essentially clumping. And so the process of determining how to wrap different chunks of code into asynchronous blocks and tasks, and then kind of wire them all up together ends up being a little bit trickier. Let me see what I have there. One second. So this is just an example of some code that has, kind of 2 parallel branches. and then it forks out to a few different subparallel branches. These wait functions are asynchronous, meaning they're blocking. And so a G compiler that's going to do this translation needs to be able to know which nodes actually are going to block for a period of time or are intended to use some kind of synchronization, so that it can ensure that there's only one blocking call in a set of functions in tasks. So some of the work going on involves just kind of visualizing the compilation and the construction of the asynchronous tasks. So here is a representation of the data flow and control flow graphs, where the dashed lines around the outsides are essentially asynchronous tasks. And you can see we can nest them, we can fork them, and the clumping algorithm ensures that there's only one blocking call per task. And if we need another one, we have to wrap it in a subtask, and then similarly, manage kind of the futures when we need to join as well. So that is close to the end. I talked a little bit about async and await. So I think my vision, or what I'd like, the type of software engineering community ecosystem that I'd like to be a part of with LabVIEW, is that we have the tools that we need to run our code anywhere. That we, having spent 20, 25 years for myself learning LabVIEW as a profession, that we can take this skill set forward into the future, be interoperable with other languages, and also for us as graphical programmers to understand more of kind of the computer science under the hood. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting innovation and exploration still yet to happen in that space. And I think that graphical programming as a language is something that a lot of people out there, even in the software world, are sort of looking toward and trying to build kind of tools to sort of reverse engineer how their code works, when they could just use that to describe how their code works. So I would love to see an open source community working on such tools. And so, over the next many months, the tools that you're seeing here are going to be made available open source. Still trying to figure out exactly kind of direction and timing for these things. But I'm curious to find out from the crowd what you guys find interesting, confusing, exciting. Who wants to go become a compiler engineer?
So what's a use case that you would have in mind for using a Pi Pico running LabVIEW code without using add-on libraries, etc.?
Without using which libraries?
Add-on libraries that you would normally use in development of, say, C. Right? There are tons of libraries out there for Arduino to interact with peripherals, say, like I2C, right? So why the move to hardware, and what is one of the applications that you envision there?
Sure. I think so. The applications for a low-cost, highly available piece of hardware that I can program, I think there's a lot of use cases. We've had use cases for, we actually just couldn't get I2C adapters at one point in time with the supply chain, but we could get Pi Picos. And so implementing solutions on those highly available, highly affordable, they're almost fungible, right? Like, is very advantageous. I think I sort of see it as a, like, if it were easy, why wouldn't I? A question is, well, why would you program a Pi Pico in C++? C++, and there's good libraries for doing it. I think the same is true about G. I personally think, too, in terms of making programming accessible to more people, at least for me, the way that my brain works, I'm much, much more effective in a graphical environment than I am a text-based environment. So if the tooling were effective, I would probably lean that direction. However, I love to be able to dive in under the hood, all the way down the stack, to figure out what's going on and to fix it, improve it. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but
Maybe a follow-on question would be, do you anticipate developing hardware-specific external libraries that would be, could you envision calling another library?
yeah, absolutely. So currently, the way that I've been playing with this is to essentially create my own sort of application, and then to use kind of like templating to insert the business logic written in G. It's like drop an LED on off VI, and it can just call the LED on off function. But behind the scenes, at the top of the main file, there's a bunch of imports and configurations and stuff like that. But my visualizing the actual application business logic is graphical. So I don't, at least not in the short term, I don't see using this as an approach to rewrite the standard library of Rust in G. I don't think there's any benefit to doing that.
So for this G hardware, so is it possible to try multiple
Is it possible to drive
two parallelism for using? So
on the Pi Pico, there are at least two, possibly a few, different embedded frameworks that support concurrency. And so, it could do that. This is by no means out of the box ready to go, though.
do you have a plan to actually further develop not just this form, further for other
So I personally think that this is an interesting enough project to work on indefinitely. So I would love to see, like I said, a G compiler written in G. And also, I think that targeting Rust is a good choice for some things. However, there's a tremendous amount of work being done in compiler technology right now. The LLVM organization is moving towards MLIR, mid-level intermediate representation, which is a higher level of abstraction, which essentially doesn't fix the meaning of any elements of a language, and it allows transforming from dialect to dialect, compiling to GPU dialects, TPU dialects. LLVM is actually a dialect. And so more and more, what ended up happening is folks that were using LLVM, which is very operational, in a lot of ways, it's sort of like registers. And a lot of the programming languages, LabVIEW included, had developed their own intermediate representations. LabVIEW has data flow intermediate representation, which is under the hood. what is just above the LLVM layer. And so every language, Rust and C and Swift, they all were developing their own mid-level intermediate representations. So the LLVM team, along with the guy that invented Swift and founded LLVM, started working on MLIR. And a new language coming out called Mojo recently, which is going to enable compilation of Python code. Mojo is going to be like a superset of Python, claims to be like, 10, 100,000 times faster. That's not a real number, but it's supposed to be like thousands of times faster because it can essentially take Python code, generate an abstract semantic tree, generate a mid-level intermediate representation of that, and then now that it's in this intermediate representation, all the compiler engineers in the world are developing optimization transformations in this MLIR framework. And everybody can leverage each other's optimizations and even mix and match. You can include other dialects as subcomponents of your dialect. It's really incredible. So that's a very exciting area that I would love to see kind of LabVIEW move toward. And I think building tools in G that can work with those other tools and formats would be really powerful.
Is NI invested in driving that kind of thinking? In other words, what does NI gain from having? What does NI gain from having a user be able to create an executable that'll run on a Pi or any other embedded system?
What does Microsoft get out of people using VS Code to write Python scripts that run on a server running Linux?
Right, but currently, if LabVIEW has a user environment, right, an IDE that you develop your code, then you deploy that onto a PC that has all of the hardware peripherals and everything with it, all the drivers that are capable to make that application work. Now you're saying we have to create an executable for this little embedded controller. Wouldn't it make more sense for NI to add on to their IDE to create that? But in other words, does it have to be a user community thing, or isn't it just something that that NI could do?
That's a good question. They're welcome to do it.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I'll be over here doing my thing.
I think it's a great idea, by the way.
I think it's just a matter of business priorities, vision, direction. Yeah.
First, I have an answer. I don't want to be a compiler engineer, so it's my least favorite part of software engineering. But actually, you stepped in it when you mentioned threads, because I've been dying to talk to somebody about threads.
I'm not an expert.
Yeah, well, I'll broach the topic anyways, or you already did. So, first question I had about your presentation when you did the two timers, and then you went into Rust and you did your declarations and you had two threads there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, how do those two threads come about, the two separate threads? I guess was sort of question number one. But my real question is, and this is more an NI question probably, years ago, you used to be able to select from a drop-down list of threads that you wanted to execute on. Now, at least in the version that I've most recently used, which is probably 2020, you can select run on UI thread or run on any thread.
Yeah.
Which may be great for some, not great for me, because I have I have sub-VIs that I run that are sort of bookends. One is doing the execution, and then one is getting the response. And in order to run multiples of those asynchronously, the execution and the response have to be on the same thread. Otherwise, I get a communication error from that because it's trying to close out something that started on another thread. So I guess the succinct version of my question is, will definable threads or selectable threads ever come back? Or is it always going to be you can put your stuff on the UI, which is what I'm forced to do. I end up just putting all these executions and responses on the UI thread. And then of course that impacts the performance of the UI, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the thing about threads is that they call into like the core libraries of the operating system, or in the case of the Pico, like the chip vendors APIs, and so you're kind of subject to the constraints there. And I think LabVIEW's trying to abstract that, but still provide enough knobs and levers so that you can unstick yourself. But they do have the warning that says, don't mess with these because you might actually stick yourself instead of unsticking yourself. And I don't know, personally, I'd prefer not to have to worry about threads.
And just as a reminder, Jim doesn't work for NI.
And I don't work for NI, by the way, so I don't know what
He's not going to
NI
answer
cares
that
about.
question.
I wanted to follow up on something that this gentleman over here asked you, sorry. I'd forgotten what I was, so is there any reason why you wouldn't just, we've talked about, all the libraries that are available for these platforms and so forth. Couldn't you do a what is it, it's like a code module, I forget what it's called, where you actually select a DLL or whatever, and then you can execute code from a library that maybe you're in C or whatever. Does that fall in line with this? And if you were to do that, let's say your example, instead of being a timer, would be a call to a library, to an external library. Would it all compile, and would you be able to do it the way you're kind of demoing here? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So in the Pico application, as I mentioned, I actually have a Rust project with its own main.rs file. And there's a lot of stuff in that file and in the neighboring files that we don't touch during this transpilation process. And so we're just calling into that. And so you could think of that template project almost like a target. And there's a bunch of pre-configured code that exposes some high-level APIs like turn LED on, turn LED off. But we're not, literally, the way that the LEDs work is you send them a PWM signal, and that sets how bright they are. But my API just has on and off. And then the configuration of what PWM frequency to send is done outside of the scope of the transpiling. But that was kind of arbitrary. And so, where this is the answer to your question is, well, both I don't know, and yeah, you could do whatever you want, right? Like if it's open source, I guess at a certain level, somebody decides to, product manage it and, start to expose things as very high level features. But yeah, right now calling a DLL or something like that would be straightforward.
Just a very simple question. Is cool examples, very cool you're working on. But the examples you showed were very, very basic and very simple. Do you have anything more complex type of code that you're working on, or goals or anything like that for the future that you have in mind?
Yeah, I did, but I took it all apart so I can put it back together again.
So I guess would your ultimate pie in the sky goal be that you take a piece of LabVIEW code and then it has the individual components that you built out there, and there's a translator that then ultimately converts that over for just about anything?
Well, so I think that that's a very interesting and valid use case for, such tools. I think what I'm interested in is, building things that are, practical and useful and fun, and to educate myself and educate the community and get people working together around common shared problems that allow us to take our skill set and passion, for those of us who are passionate about graphical programming, and to kind of take that into the future, because I think there's a lot of things we're probably going to need to do for ourselves if we want graphical programming the way that we're used to it to continue to stay very relevant.
All right. So I may be misremembering a while ago, but I thought we hit this G compiler G milestone in the mid-2000s. I just totally off base with that.
In the mid-2000s?
Yeah, right before we started picking up LLVM.
Who's the we?
NI did.
Oh, the NI.
Yeah.
So, NI, I don't know a whole lot under the hood. I've never seen the source code. And I hear people referring to data flow intermediate representation, DFIR, and how integrating that into the LVM into the compile chain, was a pretty huge undertaking. But I don't believe that any of the compilation process is done in G. I do recall, I think that there was maybe conversion of like MScript into G code. Maybe there was work done there. But that was sort of the other way, right?
A lot of false memories in my head. I'm just trying to check in with reality every now and then.
Well, choose the ones you like.
I know. You know what it's about.
Anyone else? All right, let's give it up for Jeff.